Okay, let's get started. First of all, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our open primary conference today. My name is Doug Balder. I'm a national organizer with Open Primaries. So this is an hour long, and we plan to have about 25 minutes of presentation, after which we'll open up for questions. Please stay on mute during the presentations so we limit any background noise. And if you do wish to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand and I will call on you, at which time then you can unmute. This conversation is being co-hosted by Missouri Voter Protection Coalition and Open Primaries. Our panelists are Denise Lieberman, who is the Director and General Counsel of the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, Jeremy Gruber, who's Senior Vice President of Open Primaries, Debbie Gould, President of League of Women Voters in Tennessee, and Connor Libert with the Jones Advocacy Group in Missouri. We're going to cover a couple of topics. Why does it matter? Why do closed primaries or open primaries matter? How this fight is shaping up to either close or open primaries, but principally to close primaries, since we are running an opposition campaign to the closing of primaries. How do primaries work? Open primaries, closed primaries, how do they work? And building awareness about this. So at this point, I'm going to turn matters over to Denise Lieberman and Jeremy Gruber.
Thanks, Doug. And thank you to everybody for joining us. This is such an important conversation. For decades, many of us in the voting rights community have been rightly focused on access to general elections and working to alleviate the burdens of restricted access to general elections, but much less attention has been focused on the primaries. But because of a number of factors that have been growing increasingly relevant, the primaries are becoming the elections that are the most meaningful for so many voters today. The opponents of voting rights know that full well, and they're targeting primaries as a result, which is why we're here today. I just wanted to give a quick shout out to some folks in the audience who I'm really excited are joining us. David Cherry, who's president of the Leaders Network in Chicago and one of our board members. And of course, the Reverend Daryl Gray, who we've worked with closely to pass open primaries in St. Louis, and who's been such an important social justice leader across the country. Denise, did you have a few words before we get started?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being on. The Missouri Voter Protection Coalition is pleased to co-sponsor today's event with Open Primaries. It's wonderful to see so many of our fabulous partners from Missouri on the line here today. Missouri certainly has been on the forefront of addressing some of the issues as we saw attacks on open primaries in our state this past year, and we're going to share some more information about how that came about and some of our legislative strategies to combat it. And we're really delighted to be on the panel as well with Debbie Gould and our friends at the League of Women Voters in Tennessee.
Thanks, Debbie. So what are we talking about when it comes to attacks on access to primary elections? That's why we're all here, of course. Well, there's several forms of primary elections in use across the country. But the dominant form in the South and a handful of Midwestern and Mountain states is a particular form of open primary that combines two things: nonpartisan voter registration and an open party primary. 20 states use this model, and it's this model in particular that's under increasingly attack across state legislatures in the region. So let's start to talk a little bit about what nonpartisan voter registration actually is for those who aren't familiar with it. So if you're in a state like Tennessee or Alabama, you don't actually register with a party when you register to vote with the state. You simply register as a voter. And because you're not a registered party member, every voter can choose a party ballot, Republican or Democrat, every voter has access to this open primary system. Everyone participates. Now, legislation's been introduced in about a dozen states over the past several years, and it's increasingly moving through these states through committee that would do one of two things. Either it would impose partisan voter registration, because of course you need to be able to identify yourself by party in a closed system. Other bills invoke closed primaries outright. So what would it mean to impose partisan voter registration in many of these states that currently have nonpartisan voter registration? It would require that voters re-register and declare for the first time ever that a party affiliation with the state. And it would mean, first off, that when you're re-registering that many voters, you're re-registering the entire population of the state, it will necessarily mean that many voters were going to be left off the voting rolls during that process. Almost every bill that we've looked at in states across the country, across the region, that are looking to roll back open primaries, the sponsors have not contemplated the mechanics of what it would take to re-register voters. As a result, the likelihood that many voters are just going to be left off the voting rolls, no matter what their party affiliation or supposed party affiliation might be, is likely. But what happens regardless? So the state takes your party affiliation for the first time. That all now means that the state can decide how you the registration deadlines for when you can register and re-register with different parties. And it can also mean access to the primaries. Now, some legislation, like I said, has been introduced that only would invoke party registration and doesn't necessarily target the open versus closed primary issue, but it's a Trojan horse, because once you invoke party registration in a state, the courts have said that you necessarily cannot, as a party member, vote in the opposing party's primary. That would be, of course, a First Amendment association violation. So the moment that you invoke partisan registration is the road to closing the primary in that state. So what would it mean to close the primaries in that state? Well, it would mean that anyone who doesn't register as a Republican or a Democrat would be barred from voting in the primaries outright. So we know that the largest group of voters in the country are independents. We also know that among independents, several groups stand out. Over half of Latino voters, a third of African-American voters, over 50% of our young people are registering independent. These are the types of people that are going to be shut out if the primaries are closed. But it's not just independents, because, of course, across much of this region, we're really talking about one-party states. So it's not just independents that are going to be shut out. It's going to require particularly Democrats, including hundreds of thousands of people of color, to make a decision. Are you going to register Democrat so that you can be true to your values and perhaps vote for some local officials, but then be shut out of voting for the candidates that are going to necessarily come forward and represent you statewide? Because statewide, for many voters, the primary is the election that counts, and it's where largely the Republican primary, where the candidates are going on to the general election and winning elections. So what does that actually look like in some of these states? I want to give you some numbers so you can understand why access to the primaries for everybody is so critical. In the 2022 general election in Alabama for state legislature, 54% of races were uncontested, and less than 1% were competitive. So when you went into the ballot box in Alabama, most of the time there was only one person on the ballot, probably a Republican. In Georgia and Tennessee, 53% uncontested elections, 3% competitive in Georgia, 2% competitive in Tennessee. So the real decisions are happening in the primary in many of these states. That's why the far right of the Republican Party in this case are trying to close them. They're trying to restrict access not just to independent voters, but to many voters of color, to many Democrats as well. And that's why this is such a critical discussion that we're having right now. This is about consolidation of power. This is about restricting voting rights to the most meaningful elections in much of the South today. And that's why we're here. And I'm going to hand this over to Denise to talk a little bit in more detail about what this is looking like in Missouri.
Thank you so much, Jeremy and Doug. The Missouri Voter Protection Coalition is really pleased to partner with Open Primaries to advance fully participatory elections in Missouri. And really, that's what this is about for us. The Missouri Voter Protection Coalition is Missouri's nonpartisan state civic engagement table, our voting rights table. And we include approximately 60 affiliated organizations. I see that a large number of people on this call are here from Missouri. So thank you for being our partners in this fight. The fight against closed primaries is a critical one for anyone who cares about voter access and the ability of all voters to be able to participate. And you might be thinking, well, I don't know. I'm involved in a nonpartisan capacity. Am I getting my feet too deep in the sort of partisan pond if I start talking about closed primaries? And the answer is no. For the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, we are completely nonpartisan, but we believe in free, fair, and accessible elections for all Missourians. And we know that closing primaries is simply another tool in a broad toolbox that we've seen over the last decade or so since the gutting of the Voting Rights Act to constrict access to elections. And what we are seeing around the country, including in states like Missouri, which is sort of a canary in the coal mine sometimes for some of these battles, is efforts to make it harder to participate. That's what closed primaries do. And that's the reason that Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, even as a completely nonpartisan organization, is opposed to them. In Missouri currently, we have open primaries, like many states around the country, meaning that anyone who's registered to vote can show up at a primary election. And while primaries are facets of political parties, Missouri's open primary system allows people to get a ballot, whichever political party ballot or nonpartisan ballot they wish. A closed primary process would limit participation only to those who are officially registered with a particular political party. And Missouri fought last year, and I'm going to share with you a couple of links in the chat. We were tracking 8 bills that impacted voter access to primary elections. And one in particular, House Bill 31, that was sponsored by Representative Dan Stacy, was kind of the primary bill that moved forward. And it would have required, it would have prohibited anyone from voting in a primary election unless their voter registration established affiliation with that party. On top of that, it would require registered voters to select their party affiliation 23 weeks before the party primary election. Now, if you're doing the math there, that's 6 months. That's half a year before a primary election. So think about an August primary election prior to a November general election. We're talking back in February. So if you were not registered with a particular political party affiliation on your voter registration by February of a year in which you wanted to vote in an August primary election, you would be unable to do so. That's a pretty harsh requirement, especially given the fact that we know that most people don't start paying attention to elections until very shortly before election day. We were fortunately able to stave off this effort to close Missouri's primaries. By the way, there were several other bills as well. Senate Bill 240, sponsored by Senator Andrew Koenig. Senate Bill 392, sponsored by Senator Rick Bratton, also would have closed Missouri's primaries. Fortunately, they never were able to get the momentum that they thought they had, thanks in part to some very skilled lobbying, thanks in part to testimony by many of you who are on this call, who are part of the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, and thanks in part to the fact that there are people who have been election officials themselves, who serve on some of the legislative elections committees, who understood the barriers that this could present for election officials, who, as a general matter, find this very complicated. But I want to share a couple of things before I turn this over. You're going to hear in a little bit from Connor Lubert with the Jones Advocacy Group, which is Missouri Voter Protection Coalition's lobbying team in Jeff City, about some of the strategies we employed to knock this legislation out before it was ever able to really get out the door. And honestly, I'm convinced that that was an important factor in being able to keep this from moving. And we were able to get it stopped before it made it out of committee. And then it was largely dead in the water as long as we kept the pressure on not to bring it back. But I want to share a couple of things. For those of you who may not be in Missouri, I know many of you in this chat in this group are from Missouri, but there were a few things that came up that signaled, even several years ahead of time, that there would be a concerted effort to close Missouri's primaries. And I want to share those with you to help create kind of a first watch system. First off, in 2022, there was legislation in Missouri. It was an omnibus voting bill known as House Bill 1878. And those of you from Missouri are probably familiar with this legislation because one of the things it did was enshrine a strict photo ID requirement to vote. And the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition and our partners are currently in court on behalf of the NAACP and Legal Women Voters challenging that law. But the truth is, this legislation, which started out as a 7-page photo ID bill, became in 2022 a 53-page omnibus voting bill with literally dozens of provisions, many of which were not fully debated, and many of which advocates, even voting rights advocates, weren't necessarily aware of. One of those provisions included a change to Missouri's voter registration process. In particular, this little-known provision in House Bill 1878 now requires voter registration forms in Missouri to have an optional place to indicate your political party affiliation. That had never been part of Missouri's voter registration before. But as Jeremy said, the only way you can enforce a closed primary system is to have an official government system of party affiliation in order to be able to track that. That was a canary in the coal mine. Why else would there be optional political party affiliation included on a voter registration form? And when people began getting their notices under the list maintenance practices or opportunities to register to vote this year, lots of Missourians were confused about whether or not they were required to designate a political party affiliation. Know that this was a piece of the puzzle that was intended to carve the way for House Bill 31 and other efforts to close Missouri's primaries. The second clue that we had that this was coming was also in 2022 legislation that eliminated Missouri's presidential preference primaries, that allowed all registered voters to cast a ballot in the presidential preference primary and returned Missouri to a closed caucus system that, again, constricted who was able to participate. Those things gave us the clues that we needed to know that open primaries was going to be a major policy agenda of some folks that were interested in constricting who was able to participate. And that allowed us to plan ahead of time and team up with open primaries and to team up with our lobbying team to be prepared to fight off this effort. We believe that elections work best when all voters are able to have a seat at the table and have the ability to participate. Missouri may look to many of you as a bright red state, but we know ourselves as the show me state. And we know that Missouri voters run the gamut across the political spectrum, and many identify sometimes as Democrats, sometimes as Republicans, sometimes as independents. And it's important that all pieces of those voices are able to be heard. So I thank you, and you're going to hear more about our work and how we were able to stave off those closed primaries from our friend Connor in a moment. But I want to first turn it over to Debbie Gould, the president of the League of Women Voters of Tennessee, that's also been successful in fighting off efforts to close primaries in that state.
Well, thank you, Denise. And I would certainly emphasize this is not a one-time battle on closed and open primaries. It is an ongoing issue. And that's what we've discovered in Tennessee. So for those of you all who aren't familiar with our organization, we are a nonpartisan organization. We're volunteers, and our primary focus is supporting informed and engaged voters and systems of government, public policies that are voter-centric. And when we first started thinking about this issue, to be honest, we shied away from it because we said it's just too partisan. There's nothing more partisan than primaries. And then we started looking at it with a voter-centric lens and saying, if we really want people in a supermajority state to have choices, as you just heard from Denise, it's the same in Tennessee. We are a super majority state. And people would not have choices. We have many races that are uncontested in the general election, and primaries are the only competitive races. And again, to point out something Denise has talked about, there are certain things that we can see where there are preliminary steps that have been taken over the years that make it easier to switch from an open system to a closed system. In Tennessee, one of those changes was to make some local elections partisan. So for the very first time in 2022, our school board elections became partisan races. And as any of you all who are following any local news anywhere in this country, there is nothing more contentious than school board races. And so it very often we hear from people who say, you know, if I don't vote on the opposite side of my regular party in these local school board races, I have no vote. And so I think that this is also really important. This happened in 2022, and then in 2023 we had a move to close primaries. And so what we did in Tennessee, and it was an effective model for us, at least for this past year, is that we really began by educating our own league members from across the state to really understanding this issue, because we had never we'd all grown up in a state that had open primaries. We just sort of assumed that was just the way you do things. And so it was a big change. We had to educate our members, and we're very thankful that Jeremy Gruber was able to come and do a webinar for us that really helped us spread that information, not just to our members, but to a larger audience. And we used that basis to come up with a consensus in our group to say, yeah, this is an issue. If we're a voter-centric organization, nothing's more important than figuring out this primary piece. And so with that, we were able to get consensus. We ended up providing in-person testimony to both our state House and Senate committees, which frankly are the decision makers. Our General Assembly pretty much agrees with whatever comes out of committee. So we were able to stop that. We got great press coverage. We also did a real full-on press with all our members across the state, sending a direct communication with their legislators. So we think that all that kind of helped create an atmosphere of if not support for open primaries, at least a feeling among legislators of ambivalence, that maybe they would lose more than they would gain, especially considering the number of independents in our state. So altogether, we were really pleased with the results this year. But at the same time, we also have an administrative change that came through that we are very concerned about, which is, again, to Denise's point, these things just don't go away. And the change is that there would be a sign posted in for every primary at polling locations that would say you have to be a bona fide member of a party. But we don't register in our party registration. So nobody knows what that means. But we do know that however it's interpreted, if someone's convicted of this, that it's actually a Class C misdemeanor. So it does have some teeth in it that we're very concerned about. So anyway, we certainly hope that Missourians, is that how we say it, Missourians, do well in attacking this issue and maintaining their open primaries. So with that, I'll turn it over to Connor. Are you next?
I believe so.
Yes.
Thank you, Debbie. So to everybody, hi, I'm Connor Luber with the Jones Advocacy Group. As Denise said, we're one of the lobbyists for Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, as well as the Missouri State Conference of the NAACP, and among other different kind of grassroots organizations. I'm going to piggyback on a lot of what Denise said earlier about what happened in the last couple of years. So, but first, I want to point out that even in Missouri it's a near supermajority. I mean, for all its intents and purposes, it is, but that could change, and then that could change very quickly. We had a lot of open spaces, but closed primaries are not a favorable position to take, even among some of the more far right people. They tend to not run on that because polling shows that the vast majority of voters are fervently against it. They don't like the idea. So most of the times you see these bills come in. Like what Denise said, we had 8 last year that would pertain to this. There were 2,200 bills filed. So 8 out of 2,200. So again, and the vast majority of them, the ones that were standalone, didn't even get a committee hearing. So that's why the main way that they are attempting to pass is they're trying to sneak it in. And that's what they did with that photo ID bill, with House Bill 1878, which removed the presidential preference primary, brought in the caucus system, but that's where they started with the party registration. And it says in the bill itself it's not required, but it's just like, hey, here it is if you want to fill it out. The goal here is to get people used to the idea. Is you start getting more and more people to see that on their registration forms and start saying, oh, I should fill it out. And they'll think, oh, this year I'm voting Republican. They'll put that on there. And then the next thing they know, they're in it. And a lot of the times you'll get sponsors who try to say, well, we'll make it so that you can change it on the same day. But we all know that's like, no, anytime you add an extra step to this, it decreases the amount of people willing to take that step. And that's the goal here, because then this last year, during some strange events that happened at the end of the legislative session in Missouri. Oh, and I do apologize. Most of my stuff will be Missouri centric. We had an instance where they said we were going to reinstate the presidential preference primary, but it included language that would have required it to be a closed presidential preference primary. So that right there was another attempt. They added that in in the last week of session after a conference committee in which they are not legally allowed to add more things to it. So this is the kind of things you're going to see, because, like I said, it's not a very popular position among the voters. We have a lot of instances, and again, with the bills, the standalone bills of closed primaries, they very, very rarely even get a committee hearing, but they're there so that they can be eventually added as amendments, and that's where they'll actually put it in. And that's the plan, is just kind of keep closing in and closing in and closing in until a closed primary is more palatable. The key things that we need to focus on how we combat these sort of things is, I want to kind of piggyback now off of what Debbie Gold just said, is don't make this you don't need to make it a partisan issue, make it a voter issue. Because if you just go out and say, if you're in a Republican controlled state like Missouri, and you just say, well, we have to go out and attack Republicans on this, that's the absolute wrong way to handle this. And I'll give you the perfect example. I don't know if she's on here, but Representative Peggy McGaugh was a big champion of election rights this last year, or has been since she's in, because she's also a former election official and is the chair of the House Elections Committee. She filed a bill last year that would have gotten rid of the party affiliation on the registration. And so what happened was she went and presented that bill in her own committee, but was then chastised by the vice chair, who was Representative Dan Stacy, who was one who filed a closed primary bill. And that back and forth pretty much kind of showed everybody, it's like, oh, the party is not on the same side here. This is not a Republican Party issue. This is an individual issue. And for all intents and purposes, that's basically where the bill died, but it did show that there is resistance to this. Legislation is another part, because it's not just paying attention to when a bill that plainly ends closed primaries comes in. It's also seeing what could it be attached to. You see this voting bill coming up and you're like, uh-oh, this kind of looks like a vehicle here. Listen to what they're saying, and just paying attention to what gets added. Voter advocacy, I want to give a shout out to Denise on this one. MOVPC has been really good about this one, about informing people, when, like in Missouri with the party registration, is not required to fill out your voter registration card. So Denise, and all the different voting rights groups have been very good about making sure people recognize that you don't actually have to do that. But the other thing is just knowing people, or is letting people know that these sorts of things are happening. Because I think that's the biggest concern that I have, is there's a lot of people who don't know that this is happening, and don't know that this is an issue, and yet this is an issue that it keeps popping up. One of the other things I want to point out is getting involved. And this is the key issue here, is knowing your legislators and building a relationship with them. And again, I have to speak for Missouri on this, but I feel as though, because there's so many times where you don't have to be a lobbyist, you don't have to be anybody high up in any position, you can just be a constituent. Call your legislator. 9 times out of 10, they have their cell phone on their website. You can just call them. But getting to know them, getting to know the ones, especially in the relevant committees. Like, for example, I was talking about Peggy McGaugh being the elections chair. It was because of her, because she gets to choose what bills are being heard in her own committee. So most of the closed primary bills were not heard in her committee because she says, we're not doing this. And then in the Senate side, you have Senator Elaine Gannon, who was the same way. She also was like, no, we're not, like, these bills are unpopular, and we're not going to hear them because it's not the right thing to do. So yeah, getting to know your legislators and getting to know the committees are without a doubt the number one thing you can be doing, and just staying on top of it. And with that, I hope I answered some questions, but if anyone has any questions, please let me know, and I will hand it back.
Thanks, Connor. And thanks, Denise, Debbie, Connor, and Jeremy, for your thoughts on this. Before we go on, I just wanted to ask if there's anybody who would like to get more support from any of us on legislation that might be coming up, or just to further educate you and your groups. Drop your contact information in the chat, and we'll follow up. So at this point, we have about 20 minutes left. We'd like to open it up to any questions, comments, thoughts that you may have. You can unmute yourselves, raise your hand, your virtual hand, so I can see it, and I'll call on you. Maybe this is a good time to reemphasize what Connor was saying about lots of people don't know this is happening. And in some ways, maybe even asking questions about it is difficult. But
can I ask a question? Again, I know there's lots of folks on here from Missouri, but how, for those of you not in Missouri, are you in states where you've had efforts to close your primary elections? If so, how did you learn about it, and how did you respond?
Well, I'm coming in from Texas, and so we didn't have that happen across the state, just in some select areas, but there wasn't enough buy-in to make that happen. So we didn't have to really put up much of a fight. I do see that the trajectory is changing, and we might need to start organizing and galvanizing people around the possibility that this will happen the coming year. So
there was a bill in Texas that Brian Slatton sponsored. He was, I believe, forced to leave the legislature due to some legal issues, but that bill was not did not move at all. But I would anticipate, given how many bills did pass in Texas to criminalize really criminalize infractions, voting infractions, that this bill may come back in much greater force next year.
Doug, one thing I'd like to add, and I think Denise is so much ahead of the curve on this, and Missouri is so much ahead of the curve on this, but I don't want to skip over this. And that is that access to primary elections as part of the agenda of the voting rights world, the civil rights world, is something that is very much new and developing. And many states, the conversations we're starting to have, we're starting at the point of, should this be on the voting rights agenda? Should access to primaries be on the voting rights agenda? I'm so excited that we're in Missouri, where we don't have to ask that question anymore. But in many states, that question is being asked. And I don't want to skip over that question, because it's an important one if we're going to make real progress across this country, is getting more and more leaders in the voting rights community to begin to just talk about, discuss, debate access to the primaries as part of the larger voting rights agenda. It's a critical moment for that discussion. And I hope this call is the beginning of spurring more discussions like that.
Absolutely.
I'd like to add just one thing, and for people who might be hesitant about being engaged in this, one of the other pieces of rationale about why primaries need to be accessible to everyone is that state government pays for them, or election commissions pay for them. It's not the political parties that pay for running a primary. And so it's publicly funded, even if it's, shall we say, a private club. And I think that's a real important distinction when people feel a little hesitant that maybe they shouldn't go into that turf.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on that. I do see that Willow has their hand up. But I really agree. For the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, obviously, we're a nonpartisan organization, but we use as our guidepost when assessing legislation whether or not this makes voting more accessible, whether it opens the doors of access to people, because that's really our bottom line. Are all eligible voters able to make their voices heard, regardless of what they have to say? And what we know, and of course, if you look at the history of primaries, they've historically been closed. We saw efforts, of course, after the post-Reconstruction era to mandate all white primaries that ultimately got struck down. But we know that it's an important channel of being able to speak in a political sense. And the way that I looked at it was that this was among a range of voter suppression tools that were designed to constrict the electorate by making it harder to register to vote, by making it by reducing who is able to participate in primary elections. And so we saw it as another tool in a ever increasing and diverse toolbox that's designed to make the people who are making decisions a smaller and smaller and smaller group. And for us, that's antithetical to a robust and functioning democracy. And that's why for us, this was not a partisan, this did not raise partisan concerns at all.
Willow?
Hi, thank you so much for all of this information. It's really helpful. I was wondering if you have noticed maybe a national trend of closing primaries. I know there was talk about how, it's still a question that, is still is still a question in the nation. And, are there certain states specifically that seem to be hammering this voter right more than others?
Well, the trend, Willow, has actually been in the opposite direction, which is opening primaries, moving from closed to open partisan primaries or to nonpartisan primaries in states like California, Washington, Alaska. But every time you see progress, there's always going to be forces that are trying to turn the tide in the opposite direction, of course. And so we're seeing attacks in a dozen states, particularly of the model that Missouri has, and much of the South has, this combination of nonpartisan voter registration and open primary. So we've seen the legislation introduced in a dozen states, and we're tracking legislation right now. Many sessions are already over, but in Ohio, they're debating closing the primaries right now. They have a year-long session. So this is an ongoing thing across the entire region. And our efforts to combat it collectively are going to be necessary in order to successfully push back and make sure that the progress that we're seeing is entirely about access and more open access in every state that we're working in. I just wanted to add one thing, because Denise made me think it's kind of important to realize, where did primaries come from? A lot of times we talk about primaries as if they're the party's primaries. And of course, Debbie mentioned the fact that, quite rightly, that they're taxpayer funded. These are publicly funded and administered elections. But why are they publicly funded and administered? Well, the reason is because primaries were never meant to be for the parties to begin with. 100 years ago, we didn't have primaries. You only voted in the general election. And what would happen is that voters increasingly got agitated, because by the time they showed up to vote in the general election, all the decisions had been made for them because the party leaders and the special interests would get together and they'd hammer out compromises, they'd pick candidates, and by the time you showed up in November, everything had been decided for you. That's where primaries came from. They came from the voters, not the parties. The voters saying, we want to be able to have a say in who the candidates are, what the agenda is at the beginning of the election season, so that we could fully shape that as voters. So parties actually fought the use of primaries for 50 years. It was only actually until in the 1960s, even though primaries started to be passed in the early 20th century, it was the 1960s where they actually became commonplace. And that's because the parties fought them for years. Finally, they embraced them. And once they embraced them, they said, well, they're ours, right? There are primaries, but they're never intended to be for the parties. They were always intended to be for the voters and to give voters access early on to candidate selection and to agenda setting. So that's important. It's an important distinction for people to understand.
Patricia O'Rourke, are you raising your hand, or I wasn't sure?
I think I saw Shannon from Rasmussen from Tennessee. Yeah.
Hi,
Go ahead,
Shannon.
Shannon.
Hi, y'all. I just wanted to echo kind of what you just mentioned and what Debbie said a while ago. We had a small group that spoke at the legislature when they tried to pass bills recently to close the primaries, and the education piece was so important because what was pretty amazing was the illogical, the frankly false arguments that they tried to use. Our legislators made connections and tried to make arguments that allowing independent voters to vote in a Republican primary was akin to the Baptists getting to tell the Presbyterians how they ought to run their church. And they used comparisons about the Civitan organization trying to tell another organization how to run their affairs. And so they really leaned into this notion that this was a private organization and that they were funding this and they should be able to make these decisions. And the argument worked, I think, as long as people believed that these were privately funded educations, and so that privately funded elections or primaries. And so that education piece was really, really important for people to know how they worked and why they worked and what the role really was, because our legislators really leaned into a potential lack of understanding that voters might have about how these primaries really worked. So I just wanted to share that because I thought it was very interesting.
Thanks, Shannon. Angela?
Hi, my name is Angela Gobble, and I work for Fair Vote, which is a national nonprofit, but I actually live in St. Louis. So I have a Missouri-related question, and that is there an initiative, or is the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition interested or intending to revisit the party affiliation statute, the change from 1878?
Angela, and Connor, feel free to jump in, or other folks on the call. Do you mean are we looking to revisit the change that House Bill 1878 made with regard to now allowing an optional political party affiliation on the voter registration form?
Yes. Are you looking to basically repeal that? I mean, that has, as you said, it opens the door to what could be greater consequences. So are you trying to roll that back, or are you going to let that go and stop the gate now, or what are your plans?
Yeah, so there was legislation introduced last year that would have done just that. And we supported it. Separately, there was also legislation introduced last year that would have reinstated the presidential preference primary, and the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition supported that as well.
Yeah, I was going to piggyback on that. Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh no, my further up question was, is that I don't know exactly whether, do you guys sponsor the legislation, or maybe that's Joan Advocacy finds a sponsor for it, or how does that work?
So the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition is a big it's the state table. It's the state civic engagement table. The Jones Advocacy Group are our lobbying team, and they work very, very closely under the dome all the time. They've been sending me around to meet with lawmakers all the time. So we do spend a lot of time meeting with lawmakers to talk about those things. Right now, that type of legislation is not at the top of our affirmative priority list for next year, because there are some other measures that look like that are proactive that look like they are going to move forward. But I'll let Connor explain a little bit further about that legislative process. And Angela, it's really great to know that we've got some fair vote folks in Missouri, and would love to have you get active with the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition.
Yeah, all I wanted to point out when we're talking about that specific legislation, well, for one, what I kind of mentioned earlier when I was talking about is, so House Bill 781, which again was filed by the chairwoman of the House Elections Committee, Peggy McGaugh, actually was to get rid of the party affiliation. There was nothing else in the bill, and that was the one where they resulted in some pushback. It was a pretty contentious hearing, but that's how these sort of things are. And as Denise was just saying, there has been some push to get the presidential preference primary back, get it back and to have it be open. Most of the time, like, there are cases where I myself will write legislation, Denise will write legislation, and we will shop that around to various legislative sponsors, be it be it House member Peggy McGaugh or Senator Elaine Gannon, whoever we feel would be the best voice for this. And generally anybody who we think would be on our side with that. What is surprising is how little we actually have to do that. It's because turns out there are some good people in the Missouri legislature who really don't like the idea of screwing with this, and they happen to be in positions of power, and it's very helpful to have them there. So basically, they'll write it, and then we'll just show up in force and say, "Hey, we got a whole group of people who like this too, or who are against it just like you are." So,
Angela, I put a link to that bill in the chat for you.
I see a question from Gene Dugan. I'll read the notice in the chat. To replace Missouri's March presidential primary, media reports indicate that the state will have a Republican caucus on March 2, similar to how Iowa selects delegates. Democrats will set up polling places on March 23. Will unaffiliated voters be able to participate in either? I guess, Denise, that might be, or Connor, a question for you guys.
Yeah, that's unclear. I mean, with the because the presidential preference primary elections have been eliminated, the system now reverts to the political parties to run their own caucus systems, and so they will set up the rules that they want to set up.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, is it okay if I jump in and say that the plan is posted on the Missouri Democratic Party's website, and it indicates that if you are unaffiliated or registered as a Democrat, you may vote. If you are registered as a Republican, you may not vote in the Democratic primary. But unaffiliated voters, which most people in Missouri are, will be able to vote either in person or by mail in the Missouri presidential primary, preference primary.
And I don't know the answer either to the Republican Party.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or thoughts? So a couple of people have put their contact in the chat for getting more information to become more engaged in their state. We'll follow up with you on that. And we certainly hope that this will be there'll be many more of these conversations and forums. And if there are opportunities where anybody feels they would like to talk more about closed and open primaries, I'm sure we could reprise this group to talk about that with you elsewhere in the United States. But let us know. You can reach Denise through the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, and you can reach Jeremy through Open Primaries. I think if you Google MOVPC or openprimaries.org, those websites will pop up. So unless there's other questions or comments, thoughts.
Doug, I put my email. I saw Denise put her contact info too in the chat. Please contact us directly to get involved. Open Primaries is working with state leaders in a dozen states at least on defensive work. And if you want to get involved in defense, some of this legislation will certainly be coming in January in your state legislatures. And we're happy to present at any forums that would be helpful to you in understanding your members or your coalitional partners more about this issue and how to get involved. So please do let us know.
And I invite you to get involved in the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition's legislative advocacy work. We will be tracking all of the bills that impact voting rights, and we do have a pretty exciting proactive agenda, and we will be ready to go on the defense with respect to any efforts to constrict the ability of Missourians to participate in their elections. So feel free to sign up for our action alerts, and you'll get access to that legislative tracker where we try to keep everybody up to date on any hearings that are coming up and provide talking points and links to submit testimony online and all of that good stuff.
Great. So I just want to thank Denise, Debbie, Connor, Jeremy for pulling together your thoughts on this panel. And we'll be seeing, I'm sure, a lot of you many times going forward, particularly as the legislative sessions start up again in January. So thank you all for participating, and look forward to seeing you again.
Thanks, everybody.